So it is a bit after the hour, after 1 minute after 9 Mountain Time, and I'm Richie Davidson, and I'm very happy to be with all of you this morning. I'd like to just begin by expressing my deepest appreciation to all of you for showing up and participating, and to the Upaya community, and particularly to Roshi Joan. I've been participating in this symposium for many, many years. And each year I ask myself, why am I doing this again? And very, very immediately, I recognize that the reason I continue to participate is because of my deepest appreciation, respect, and admiration for Roshi Joan Halifax and for all she is doing in this extraordinary community at Upaya. One of the amazing silver linings of this pandemic is that so many people can participate in this. If we were all at Upaya, it would be a smaller group. And one of the virtues is that we can extend this to so many other beings. I do want to say, though, that if you have the opportunity, please visit Upaya. It is a very special place, and the community that it holds is precious. And our symposia that we've held each year on the Upaya campus have really been an inspiration to all of us who've participated. So it is with the background of deepest appreciation that we begin this new day today. I'd also like to express my appreciation to Al Kazniak, who has been just beside Roshi in helping to organize these amazing meetings, and to all the other translators and technical folks who have made this possible. So we're going to begin with a little bit of practice this morning, and we have developed a framework that is at the core of our center these days for understanding the plasticity of well-being. And this practice that we'll do together this morning is really a practice that is based upon this framework. The framework holds that there are 4 pillars that are critical for the plasticity of well-being. And I'll say more about that in my talk, but very briefly, those pillars are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And this practice will cover each of these 4 pillars. So let's please find an upright posture, comfortable, but dignified, not too tight, not too loose. And if you're so inclined, you may close your eyes. If not, please keep them open, whichever you find most comfortable. And we'll begin with awareness. We can think of this as being present. And let's begin by being present with our bodies and bringing awareness into our bodies and simply noticing whatever may be present and allowing the body and mind to begin to settle. And in the tradition in which I practice, for every session, however brief, we always like to remind ourselves at the very beginning why we're here, why we engage in this activity together, and reminding ourselves that taking a seat in this way is a radical act of generosity. We don't do this only for ourselves, but recognizing how a calm mind and an open heart is beneficial to all the beings that we connect with, directly or indirectly. So let's spend a few moments reflecting on this motivation and bringing awareness into our bodies. And simply noticing what's happening. How are we feeling in our bodies? No need to change or fix anything. Simply infusing our bodies with awareness. Noticing the quality of our mind as we shift from a mode of doing to one of being. And now, as our minds and bodies begin to settle, let's move on to connection. This is really about feeling connected. And let's bring into our mind and our heart some being that we value and care about. Any being. And notice what we appreciate about this person. And even imagining what we might say to express our appreciation. We might even imagine some moment of warm-hearted connection, maybe a hug, maybe a handshake, maybe simply a glance. And now, imagine what this person might express back to us, what they may appreciate about us, about you. What might they say to you to express their appreciation? What might they be feeling? And now, let's collectively, right now, set the intention for every person on the planet to feel valued and appreciated. And let's see if we can see this practice that we're doing right now as a step in that direction. we will move on to insight. And this is really about getting curious. Getting curious about our experience. What is going on in your life that might benefit from a fresh perspective? Imagine that you are completely free of your past expectations, memories, beliefs, and concepts about yourself, assumptions. How might you experience the world differently, or a particular situation differently, if you were freed from the constraints imposed by these beliefs and expectations? How might you view yourself? How might you view other people? How might you see the situation completely differently? And see if you can notice how your expectations, and particularly your beliefs and concepts about yourself, shape your experience. And now we will move on to purpose, which is about staying motivated. So let's all now form an inspiring motivation. It is truly a gift that we can all assemble today in this virtual community. Let's collectively reflect on what impact we may have on this world. I think everyone participating today would agree that the world can benefit from some healing. Let's form an inspiring motivation for how we might have a beneficial impact on the world. Let's use whatever insights we glean from our participation in this community to do good for the world. What impact might you have? Think big and form this inspiring motivation for being here today, and also for whatever it is that is your work to do on this planet for your entire life. As we transition back into the content of the workshop, for those whose eyes have been closed, please open them. and see if you can connect and reconnect to this motivation as we re-engage and consider the topics that we will be considering for the remainder of the day. So thank you all for your practice, and please take a moment to stretch, breathe, before we transition to a formal presentation. Thank you.
Richie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. So I will share my screen if that's okay. I need the host to enable me to share, please. Is there a host who can enable me to share? Okay, we'll start in a moment. Okay, I now can share. And can everyone see this now? It's okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, very good. So this is a short talk. It will be varied, and we'll hopefully have time that at the end that Alyssa Eppel will lead in our discussion. I want to first start with a picture that I've shown many times, but actually a couple of pictures just as a source of inspiration. This is His Holiness the Dalai Lama on one of his 16 visits to Madison, where we were showing him an MRI scanner for the first time. This was taken in 2001, and he has been such a deep inspiration for all this work. And just this past Sunday, a week ago, I actually was on Zoom with His Holiness, the first time I've ever had a Zoom interaction with him. And we filmed it for ABC Nightline. It's online now, if those who might be interested. And he was sharing some wonderful words of wisdom and counsel in this challenging time. This is the Varela Symposium, and it's important that you all see Francisco with his beautiful smile and very separated front teeth that I always loved to see. And you saw it often because he was often smiling. And I want to begin with two quotes of Francisco. And I'll read them to you. If everyone would agree that their current reality is a reality, and that what we essentially share is our capacity for constructing a reality, then perhaps we can all agree on a meta agreement for computing a reality that would mean survival and dignity for everyone on the planet, rather than each group being sold on a particular way of doing things. The translators have seen this quote in advance, so hopefully it will be okay. The second quote, when a living system is suffering from ill health, the remedy is found by connecting with more of itself. I love that. And what I'd like to do in this first little bit of this talk is to remind us of the attributes of ourselves that we can reconnect to during this time of the pandemic. So one of the powerful lessons from the pandemic, which His Holiness the Dalai Lama spoke about, is interdependence. If anyone had any doubt about our interdependence before the pandemic, those doubts should now have been erased. The pandemic, this virus knows no national borders or religious boundaries. It has spread without regard to political affiliation, and this is a real teaching on interdependence. There's also such an opportunity to recognize basic goodness. There is just an outpouring of, and despite all of the current chaos and difficulty, if we really look in a granular way at the density of everyday experience, there's much more goodness than there is badness. The badness gets a lot of press, but the goodness is all over the place. And this is an invitation to simply recognize that goodness. People, the very act of being physically distant is itself an act of basic goodness. We are doing this not only for ourselves, but to minimize the likelihood that we become vectors spreading this virus. The term social distancing is a very unfortunate term. Let's all agree to stop using that term. We're being asked to physically distance, not to socially distance. One of the benefits of today's modern world is that we can be physically distant and socially connected. And that is, in fact, what we're doing together in this virtual community. And so social connection is so important. And I think it's just a very unfortunate choice of words that our public health officials have arrived at. But we can help by shifting the discourse and call it physical distancing. There's so much opportunity for appreciation. We're all spending, I think, more time in our local environment, and we have an opportunity to appreciate many things that maybe we haven't so much appreciated before. We all need to survive through the actions of others. There are people who are delivering goods to us. There are people who are our healthcare providers, who are on the front lines. There are people who are delivering our mail, packages. There are people who are still farming. These are all such rich opportunities for appreciation. And this is such an important emotion that can be nurtured. There is rejoicing in meta-awareness. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, one of the things, just one example for now, one of the things that we're being asked to do in this pandemic is to not touch our faces, particularly if we've been outside. How many of you have noticed when you might be approaching touching your face, but then you remember, oh, I'm not supposed to touch my face? That's a moment of meta-awareness. And there are many opportunities with the current recommendations, and in certain cases, mandates for physical distancing and remaining at home, and rules of interaction that are different from our conventional way of living that this is a rich opportunity for meta-awareness, because we need meta-awareness to remind ourselves to do these things. And finally, resilience is the capacity to bounce back from adversity. To paraphrase the bumper sticker, stuff happens. And one of the hallmarks of well-being is the capacity to recover rapidly from adversity. And so being able to recognize resilience and to help nurture it is fundamental and such an important lesson that we can learn during this period. Now, I want to spend the first little bit of time on what I consider to be an urgent need. Now, I should say that this argument was formulated before the pandemic. And I think that the pandemic only underscores the need and accentuates it in many cases. But I'd like to review with you a set of findings that we may think of as public health findings that underscore the urgency of this need. And one of the reasons why I and many others consider the cultivation of well-being to be, in fact, an urgent need, and we can think of this as an urgent public health need. So I'm showing you now some slides from the last edition of the World Happiness Report. This report, and I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, I'll point out specific elements of this, but these are data for 131 or 32 countries around the world in whom a standard metric of well-being or happiness was used in a national survey. And this World Happiness Report is issued each year for the last about 5 years under the auspices of the United Nations. The principal author is Jeff Sachs, who is an economist at Columbia. And we can debate the methodological inadequacies, which are many, but these are the only data we have that are standard across 132 countries in the world. So I thought I'd point out a few countries. This is data first on the happiness of individual nations in the last period, which this report was issued in 2019, and these are data between 2016 and 18. And so I'll just point out a few countries. Here is the United States. It's number 19 on this list. And I know that there are friends and colleagues here, particularly from Brazil and from Spain. So I'd like to point out those countries as well. Spain is number 30 on this list, and Brazil is 32 on this list. But really what's more informative, and what the World Happiness Report this year did for the first time, is to characterize the 10-year trend in happiness for all of these nations on this same metric. And the next set of slides presents the 10-year trend data. So these are countries where the happiness has been increasing. This is a list on this page of countries 1 to 52, rank ordered by the relative increase in happiness. And then as these lines get smaller and smaller and approach zero, there is no change in happiness over the course of these 10 years. And then as the lines move to the left, it indicates that there is a decrease in happiness. So let me show you where several countries fall. Brazil is 99th here. That is across 132 countries, it is ranked 99 in showing a decrease in happiness over the course of these 10 years. And the United States is 112. It's surrounded by Zambia and South Africa in showing one of the largest decreases in happiness. And sadly, Spain is 121 out of 132 countries. Spain is bordered by the Ukraine and Egypt. And so these data are reflecting a very pervasive, I think, and troubling trend in showing a decrease in happiness or well-being in these nations. Now, there also are more specific constituents or pillars of well-being that can be identified that are showing similar disturbing trends. Distractibility. 47% of the time, the average adult is not paying attention to what they're doing. These come from data from a very famous study that was published about 10 years ago. And this is a very disturbing trend. And we have the strong conviction that we could do better. Loneliness. Recent data show that 76% of middle-aged Americans report moderate to high levels of loneliness. And loneliness is more than a twofold predictor of mortality compared to obesity. So loneliness is not simply a subjective emotion, but it is something that gets under the skin and takes a toll on our biology. This is a very important paper that was published a few years ago by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Some of you may know that Angus Deaton received the Nobel Prize in economics for this work. And they showed in this paper for the very first time in US history that there was an increase in morbidity and mortality, and specifically a decrease in life expectancy among a certain segment of our population. And this is among white, non-Hispanic, low-income Americans who are actually dying sooner. And another unfortunate trend in US culture. Depression is also on the rise. Over just the last roughly 5 years, there's been more than a 33% increase. These are diagnoses of major depression. And you can see that this is split between men and women show roughly double the rates of depression compared to men. And this gender difference has been seen in every Western country in which it's been investigated. And these trends are not only true for adults, they're also true for kids. This is data for teenagers over a 10-year period of diagnoses of major depression in kids aged 12 through 17. And these rising trends are quite disturbing. And again, the gender difference, as you see on the right, is increasing. And it's increasing primarily because of the skyrocketing rates of depression among females. Now, one of the fascinating issues with the gender difference, which I'll just mention, we can talk about it later, is that pre-adolescence, the incidence and severity of depression in boys and girls is essentially identical. And during adolescence, this gender difference emerges and it remains for the rest of the life. My conviction is that there are preventative strategies that we can deploy pre-adolescence that have the potential of shrinking that gender difference as our youth go through adolescence, something we can talk about. And suicides are also on the rise. There's more than one teenage suicide every day in the United States today. And these trends are very disturbing. So this guy that I'm showing you, some very small number of you might recognize. I don't expect him to be a household figure. He was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States for 13 years. He's someone that I happen to know pretty well. He was interviewed for an interview about a year and a half ago. And he's now retired from his position as director. And he made an extraordinary statement in this interview that was published. And I'd like to read this quote to you. He said, "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realize that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think 20 billion US dollars, I don't think we move the needle in reducing suicides, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." Quite an extraordinary statement. And today, Tom Insel is a strong advocate of mindfulness and other behavioral and mental strategies that we currently believe can actually produce a more specific change in our brain states and in our biology than any currently known pharmaceutical. I'll say that again, just for emphasis. Today, many scientists believe that we can achieve a more specific change in our brain circuitry and in our biology than we can produce by any known pharmaceutical. Pharmaceuticals have side effects, and those side effects are a reminder that they're blunt instruments. And it's not that I am anti-medication. I'm not. I certainly believe they have appropriate and judicious use at times. But I also believe that they're overused and that we can do a lot with our own minds. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce the 4 pillars of a healthy mind, which are the 4 components of well-being that I mentioned very briefly during our practice together. The first pillar is awareness. And I'll say more about awareness because that is the focus of our topic for this symposium. But let me just say at the outset that there are 2 important features of awareness that are particularly significant for well-being. One is the capacity to voluntarily regulate our attention, and the second is meta-awareness. The second pillar of well-being is connection, which is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships. Qualities like appreciation and kindness and compassion. The third pillar of well-being is insight, which is really self-knowledge. It's knowledge about how our minds actually work, particularly in relation to this entity we call the self, this narrative that we have. And part of well-being is cultivating a healthy sense, a healthy relationship to this narrative. Finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. Purpose is about finding one's true north, and most importantly, aligning our everyday behavior with our core sense of purpose. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on just the first element of well-being, the first pillar, awareness. But I'd like to simply say, and this is also where mindfulness would be, but I'd like to simply say that strategies to promote well-being that focus exclusively on this would be like going to the gym and just working on your upper body. It'd be good for your upper body, but it actually, after a while, may lead to some imbalance. We need all 4 pillars of well-being in order to nurture a truly healthy mind and to flourish. Okay, so let's move on to awareness. The person on the right is William James. He's been mentioned before, I think by Jonathan Schooler. Whenever you delve into awareness, it's worth digging into some of James's writings, who was so extraordinarily prescient about this topic. But I just have his picture to remind us of his influence on this field. One of the important ways in which we've gleaned insights related to awareness has been to study exceedingly long-term practitioners. This is a photograph of my teacher, Mingyur Rinpoche, who has been to our lab many times. And this is a photograph taken from one of the early visits where we were first exploring brain electrical changes that might be associated with particular types of meditation practice. And with each of these very long-term practitioners, we did extensive life interviews to document the amount of formal practice in which they are engaged. And at the ripe age of roughly when we first had him in the lab, age of around 22 or 23, Mingyur Rinpoche already had 60,000 plus hours of practice. You can do the arithmetic at home, but I can tell you that 60,000 hours is a kind of daunting number, and it is quite humbling. And we've discovered all kinds of interesting things in these people's brains, which I'm really not going to focus on today, but it is just a backdrop for the other work that I'll talk about. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the functional significance of awareness. Why is it that we have this very special quality of our minds? And one of the functions of awareness is to afford a certain kind of freedom that minimizes the influence of unconscious biases. One of the things that Jonathan talked about yesterday is that there's so much going on, and also Kalina mentioned this, there's so much going on under the hood. That is, as David Eagleman has suggested, incognito, unconsciously. When you reflect on our own experience, the very act of speaking, of generating a grammatical sentence, is enormously complicated, yet we are completely unaware of the mechanisms in our mind that are associated with producing this kind of really complicated product. So much goes on unconsciously. We also have all kinds of unconscious biases that really impact how we treat other people, how we experience the world. And these unconscious biases can really have detrimental effects. And they may be biases that are that operate quite every day. Let me give you one kind of example. If in the morning on a particular day you had a difficult conversation with a coworker, with a family member that upset you in some way, which I think is something that some of us have occasionally, and you have to go into a meeting immediately after that. To what extent do the emotions from that first encounter bleed over and color your experience in the next period of time? That is an example of a kind of unconscious bias. We don't intend for our emotions from the previous episode to impact the next encounter, but they just happen. And they happen because of these things that are going on non-consciously in our mind. Awareness provides the opportunity to transform. Without awareness, there can be no transformation. And so this really is the source of freedom, freedom to change. So how can we begin to experimentally and rigorously tackle this in the laboratory? And I'll just give you a tidbit of a feel for how we have gone about doing this. And I won't spend too much time on it because I don't have too much time. And it's also technically complicated, but I'll do my best to walk you through this. We call this kind of unconscious emotional bias affective coloring, where the emotions from one period color your experience of the next period. So how can we study this? This is a paradigm that we've developed that allows us to study this. So in this paradigm, what we do is we take advantage of an important fact about the visual system. And that fact is that there are certain kinds of stimuli, visual stimuli, that when presented, fully capture our attention. And so what we did in this study is we presented emotional faces, which you see on the top line, and they're presented relatively briefly, but not too briefly. They're about 1 second in duration. And they're presented to one eye. And then at the very same time, we flash these crazy colored images that we call Mondrians because they look like a Mondrian painting. We flash these colored images to the other eye. And when you do this, the experience of the person is that they just see these colored images flashing. They do not see these emotional faces at all. And then a few seconds later, we show the person a neutral face. And we just ask them to make a quick judgment. How much do you like this person? From not at all to quite a bit. They just make a snap judgment. And the question that we're asking is, to what extent does the presentation of a prior fear face versus, say, a happy face or another neutral stimulus influence the extent to which a person reports not liking this neutral person? And it turns out that you can demonstrate in most people this kind of unconscious bias. So when you do this, you find that when people are unaware of the actual stimulus, when the fear face is presented, they're showing this is skin conductance, which is a measure of autonomic or sympathetic nervous system arousal. They're actually showing a greater activation to these neutral faces when they're preceded by the fear face, compared with when they're preceded by a spider or a flower. And they show this when they're unaware as well as when they are aware. We also show that there are changes in the brain. And what we demonstrate here is that awareness, and we can change the extent to which you're aware or unaware by changing the whether we're presenting those flashing mondrians during the face, or whether we're simply presenting the fear faces by themselves. And what we find is that the more amygdala activation you show when you're not aware of the fear face, the less you like the neutral person, which is what is displayed in this figure over here on the left. But when you are made to be aware of the fear face, you're no longer showing that relationship. In other words, the amygdala activation has no association with the extent to which you like or dislike this neutral person. So this simply means that awareness is affording the opportunity to break this kind of unconscious bias, and it illustrates one important role for awareness. I also wanted to make one other point. Really, I threw this in apropos some of our discussion yesterday about meta-awareness. And just to say, and I think that both Jonathan and Kalina will agree with me, that there are many different kinds of meta-awareness. And it seems that the neural basis for different kinds of meta-awareness may be different. And so we can be meta-aware of certain features and not other features of our experience. And it turns out that sectors of the prefrontal cortex are necessary for certain kinds of meta-awareness, but not other kinds. And I won't bore you with the details here, but this is a very new study that's just in press, where we use transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a experimental technique where we can transiently inactivate a region of the brain under MRI guidance to very selectively take it offline for about 20 minutes. It's kind of a wild procedure, and we can talk about it later. But when you do that, you interfere with certain kinds of meta-awareness, but not other kinds of meta-awareness. And let me just say that meta-awareness for certain emotional qualities is preserved. And so the lateral prefrontal cortex appears to be important for relatively low-level meta-awareness, but not for meta-awareness of emotions. Okay. I want to actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to just, pardon me as I skip a couple of slides. I want to just give you one tidbit here. Actually, we'll go back to just one point, and then I'll move to this next slide. And that is, I want to make the point that there's huge variation that occurs at different stages of meditation practice in terms of which regions of the brain are recruited. And one of the things that we find is a network that is important for the regulation of emotion that includes the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is really important in early stages of practice, but this network is no longer important with much more advanced practice, even though you see the same degree of emotion regulation, if not more. And so one of the points that was made yesterday about meta-awareness is that meta-awareness can be deleterious. And I would claim that meta-awareness can be deleterious when you're first cultivating it, but not at very practiced stages where that is no longer, where the engagement of the prefrontal cortex is no longer important. Okay. I also want to just mention, this is a paper that we actually just submitted a couple of days ago. It's the largest randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction that's ever been done, with a very, very rigorous active control group as well as a waitlist control group. So it's what we call in the technical jargon, a 3-arm randomized controlled trial. People are randomized to either mindfulness-based stress reduction, an active comparison group that we call our health enhancement program, or a waitlist control. And we were looking for changes in brain volume that had been reported by other investigators before with MBSR. And we found nothing, essentially. And I simply want to say this because it underscores the point. It's not that I don't believe that there are structural changes in the brain. I do believe that. But I also believe that they're very unlikely to occur with 8 weeks of practice that total about 24 hours. So it's our aspiration that this will be a corrective for the field. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes on this being an urgent public health need, particularly in this time of the pandemic. There are now several papers which have come out from Chinese scientists on the devastating psychological impact of the pandemic. This is a paper on medical health workers in the Wuhan region of China. And this is another paper on the immediate psychological responses in the general population during the initial stage of the pandemic. The levels of mental health issues that have been reported are astounding. And it underscores a very under-discussed but really necessary piece of this whole current pandemic. And this is from a very recent paper. This came out just a few weeks ago in Lancet Psychiatry, and it's from a group in the UK on priorities for mental health science for COVID-19. And I want to read to you, this is a blueprint for a response that is being developed in the United Kingdom. And despite the complicated politics in the United Kingdom, this seems to be something that is gaining a lot of traction. And let me just say, may we find such enlightened responses here in the US as well as in other parts of the country. Let me read to you one of the most important statements in this paper. And this is a kind of manifesto for what needs to happen. Develop novel interventions to protect mental well-being, including those based on positive, mechanistically based components such as altruism and pro-social behavior, and understanding of online life. Understand how we optimize positive social resources and enhance resilience in the face of stress. Establish the effects of altruism on mental health and well-being in the wake of COVID-19. Extraordinarily important, and recognizing that the cultivation of altruism and pro-social behavior itself is an antidote to many of the mental health issues that are arising. So one of the challenges is, how do we get people to start doing this? And this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem to, how do we get people to start a practice? And so one of the things that I frequently remind people is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet today, pretty much everyone on the planet brushes their teeth. it's not part of our genome. This is a learned behavior. And if we can learn to brush our teeth, I think most of us, and pardon me if there are any dentists who are tuning in today, but I think most of us would agree that our minds are even more important than our teeth. And if we can nurture our minds, even beginning with this short amount of time, I have this strong conviction that this world would be a different place. So we can start with 3 minutes a day. You can start while you're doing other things. This is a practice that can be done anywhere, anytime. You can cultivate awareness while you're commuting, while you're brushing your teeth, while you're waking up, walking. You can nourish your mind and in that way change the world. And this is just to remind us of many, certainly not exhaustive, but a number of the key outcomes that each of which has been documented in scientific research: reducing implicit bias, increasing school achievement, reducing healthcare costs, improved teamwork and collaboration, reducing distraction, and increased productivity, focus, creativity, and resilience. I mean, if someone said that they had a pill which did all that, that pharmaceutical company would just would be at the pinnacle. We can do all this with our own mind. So we have been trying to do this in our limited way by encouraging people to be citizen scientists. We've developed an app based on these 4 pillars of well-being that our aspiration is will simply help support people in their practice. This app is freely available and will always be free because of the generosity of our donors. You can learn more about it by going to tryhealthyminds.org. And the cool thing is that as you use this, you can be a citizen scientist and help us learn more about how to do this in ways that could be more effective. We just finished the first randomized controlled trial of our Healthy Minds program. And this is just one of many metrics, but this is a measure of distress over a 4-week period compared to a waitlist control group, and simply showing substantial benefit from participants. This is a group of about 366 adults who are using this program. It's freely available all over the world. Unfortunately, it's now only available in English, but we hope within the next year it will be available in Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic. So I want to end with 2 quotes. One is from Francisco, and he said, "All our suffering is associated with this preoccupation. All loss and gain, pleasure and pain arise because we identify so closely with this vague feeling of selfness that we have. We are so emotionally involved with and attached to this self that we take it for granted." And then finally, this last quote from Mingyur Rinpoche: "At any given moment, you can choose to follow the chain of thoughts, emotions, and sensations that reinforce a perception of yourself as vulnerable and limited, or to remember that your true nature is pure, unconditioned, and incapable of being harmed. You can remain in the sleep of ignorance, or remember that you are and always have been awake." Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richie, so much for this really uplifting and inspiring presentation. I'm going to invite us to move over to Alyssa, who will be moderating the session. She'll make a few comments reflecting, and then turn to the many questions that are being asked by our friends out there in the wider world, but also some reflections from our faculty.
Thank you, Richie Joan. Richie, thank you so much for this phenomenal work coming together at this time in the context of our current crises. You can imagine that our question feed is going crazy with questions. And so I'm going to try to be brief. I'm going to pose an initial question. I'm going to see if our faculty have questions for you, and then I'm going to dive into this list of questions. There's a lot of urgency that people feel. So, you know, let's just talk about that urgency, and you certainly brought it into the light. I'm thinking of 5 years ago when we were at Zen Brain, Varela Symposium, and your lab couldn't have been bigger and more exciting, but what you have done in 5 years to bring this to vectors of change to society through Healthy Mind Innovations and other work is very exciting and phenomenal, the application of this work. And so I want to push you on the application. Of course, we all want to understand the bridge between our own conscious states and metacognition and how we can train our own mind to the continuum of societal change. So the pandemic is an accelerator of change. It has exposed the cracks in our society, and we feel this sense of urgency. When I first heard Roshi Joan say, "Do not squander your life," I almost jumped out of my skin because of the dialectic of having been in such a phenomenal, peaceful, meditative state, and then the dialectic of against that, what are you going to do with this, with your being, with your short, precious life? We are exposed to communal trauma. You just pointed out so incredibly well. We have epidemic levels of depression and anxiety right now, new CDC data as well, but these are normative. That's right. We're responding to, you know, true global crises, and medications are an absurd idea in a time when we're having normative changes in our ability to, in our mental health. And of course, attention, the ability to have metacognition is the freedom to self-regulate. And it's the, you know, one of the only or most essential, but not enough. Let's just start there. So my question for you really is how you think about policy. You showed us big data on happiness, and many of our audience is dying to know, Richie, how can you point out these differences without talking about the culture, the material resources, the social network resources, the community that underlies some of these happiest countries? So how do we get there? How can our mind training, you know, bridge to changing policy? So you've taken us to institutions, you've trained large groups of people in institutions, and where do we go from there?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Alyssa, for all that you do and being part of this, and for your great questions and also your own work and energy and contributions. I think about this a lot, and it's a real difficult calculus. And the way I think about it is this is an issue that really requires us to rest in complexity and ambiguity. One of the things the Dalai Lama pointed out in his talk just a few days ago is he said, look, there are certain things that we can control and certain things that we can't control. And by saying this, he was not suggesting that we simply abandon our efforts to radically change society. I mean, I think most people in this symposium have the strong aspiration that things change, and also agree that the trajectory that we've been on is not a particularly healthy or sustainable one. So on the one hand, we need to work our butts off and do whatever we can in our own local way, in whatever skills we have. Each of us differ in important ways in our skills and in our local environments, in our connections. And we each can participate, but we participate in ways that uniquely reflect our own skill set and ecological niche. And so I think we need um, I refer to myself as an activist scientist. I believe that the scientific data are necessary, but they're not sufficient for producing the kind of change that we need to produce. And we need to continue to act on the institutions, the systems, and at the same time, we need to do that with a calm mind and an open heart. We need to do it with a quality that is infused with love, not with fear and not with anger. One of the amazing privileges I had a few years ago was meeting and spending time with the Congressman John Lewis in the United States, the African-American congressman from Georgia, who was part of the 1960s civil rights movement. He was imprisoned for 9 months for walking into a white bathroom in Alabama. And he's still a member of Congress. And John Lewis had not a smidgen of anger. I mean, his whole being was pure love. And if we can engage in social change from that perspective, I think that we will be embodying the very qualities that we seek to promote in others. And that is, I think, the most effective way of doing it. And so we need to be doing both simultaneously.
That is such a beautiful answer, Richie. Thank you so much. I think we need to have that dialogue of how we can do both at the same time. Last night, my son went to a rally downtown San Francisco, and I was terrified. My city is closed and under curfew. We had so much violence.
I just lost you, Alyssa. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
others
Alyssa, you're muted or frozen.
The aggression is not the answer. It's actually organizing in these wise ways together for change. I'll stop there. So I would love to hear from, I can see some of our faculty. Just raise your hand if you, Kalina, welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'll say on behalf of everyone, you froze for approximately 20 seconds, right when you were saying about the unrest.
Thank you so much. Can I finish my quote? My son went to a rally last night in downtown San Francisco, and I was terrified. But he felt so passionate about standing up for Floyd that I couldn't stop him. And John Lewis wrote to the world last night a quote that said, "Please organize together with wise action. The aggression in the streets is so damaging." And so I sent that to him. He did come home last night. Other people didn't come home and are in jail, etc. But I wanted to just emphasize the contemplative wisdom that Richie just mentioned, and John Lewis's life experience that shows the power of connecting around these social change forces that we need to enact as soon as possible. Kalina, thank you.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for sharing this. And I want to follow up on exactly that topic. And Richie, thank you as well for this incredibly insightful presentation. It was also very inspiring, as I've always found your work. And I want to follow up on this. And Richie, you said something very insightful at the beginning of your talk, when you mentioned the 4 pillars of the healthy mind. You mentioned that they are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And you gave us that beautiful analogy of how if you go to the gym, you shouldn't work on only the upper part of your body, or you may create imbalance. And then you proceeded to give us this beautiful work that you've been doing, including your app, which is aimed to work at the level of awareness. And it's also and I'm really interested in that app. I want to go and try it. I want to use it for studies to see what we can achieve with it. At the same time, to follow up on Elisa's question here, and to kind of present to everybody a huge challenge, how can we develop strategies, and they will likely not be through technology such as iPhone application, but something much bigger. How can we be thinking about something that will address more than the individual mind? And Richie, I agree with you wholeheartedly that the individual mind is such a powerful thing and we can do so much through it. But it's also a limited thing because we live in this very highly connected society that influences our individual minds in ways that are incredibly powerful and exceed the power of any individual mind or of all individual minds separately. So, you know, and I think this was Elisa's point as well, is going beyond, above and beyond social activism, protests, getting arrested and seeking change that way. Are there additional ways that we can be trying to change our societies so that we can achieve the change that we need for our own health and the health of our planet in ways that are more than what we can achieve through each of our own individual minds?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that comment, Kalina, and question. And I certainly completely agree with you that, and, and believe that we need to be operating on these multiple levels simultaneously. So we can't just operate on the individual level. And one of the things that we've tried to do with our Healthy Minds initiative is to work with groups, not just individuals, and work with different sectors. The sectors that we've been mostly working with are the education sector, the healthcare sector, and the workplace sector. These are big sectors that account for a lot of activity in any individual culture. And so, and we're, you know, a teeny organization and we can only, you know, have a limited bandwidth, but we need to begin somewhere. We need to start launching what I really think of this as a kind of public health campaign, and there's not going to be a single way of doing this. But, you know, in the US, when you think about recent history in our lifetimes, we've done a really pretty good job in significantly reducing smoking in the United States. That's an example of, I think, a successful public health campaign. And I think that we can learn something from public health campaigns to have a human flourishing campaign, a well-being campaign that is on the same order, that involves, you know, all of the different elements that are required to produce this kind of big change. And I think the very survival of our planet and species depends on this. And so, you know, my vision is that by 2030, mental exercise will be as commonly practiced as physical exercise is today.
Beautiful.
So I think we've got 10 years
I know, you know, I want to express my gratitude to you, Richie, for what you've shared, and also Kalina, what you shared at the end of your presentation yesterday in relation to how our neurochemical systems are shaped so much by the economies and the view that you talked about, or views that we operate out of. And so I'm just curious, Richie, about you know, your approach in relation to not only communities of color, but communities of poverty, particularly white communities of poverty, where there's a certain kind of misery that is being utilized against the well-being of you know, our entire society. You know, how would you, for example, deploy this approach in a white community of power in Missouri or Kentucky? I mean, a white community of poverty,
Yeah.
say in Missouri or Kentucky.
Well, let me, I'll answer that in a second, but let me also get to the, another piece of your question about addressing communities of color and particularly poverty, not white poverty in this case, but we're, just to give an example, we're involved in a collaboration in Mexico that involves around 250,000 elementary school kids who are living in poverty, and we're doing work with the school staff, the principals and the teachers, and doing some training with them. And the primary outcomes are actually looking at the kids. And the initial findings from this is a reach of 250,000 children. And the way we're able to do that is by not directly working with the kids, but by working with the staff, and particularly the principals of the schools. And it's been remarkably successful. And of course, we need long-term longitudinal studies to determine to what extent really this is successful. But the initial findings look extremely promising. And this is an example of bringing this to a really impoverished community. And this is, these are places in certain cases where the teachers don't regularly show up for work. And the impact has really been measurably positive. With respect to the US and the kind of white communities, poor white communities that you're talking about, I think that a lot of it has to do with how we language this. We have done some work with those communities, both here in Wisconsin, as well as through some of our efforts in Kentucky, in parts of Louisville, where we've been working with Greg Fisher, who's the mayor of Louisville, who I'm sure you know. And there's still, a huge amount that we don't know and still have to learn. But we don't use the word meditation. We don't use mindfulness. We talk about, and this is work with kids in schools. It's, with the kids of these poor white people, and talk about efforts to help them regulate their emotions and regulate their attention. And that kind of language has been well received, and with very little pushback. And so, I think we need to do this step by step. I don't think there's going to be any one solution that is going to be the right one. It's going to require lots of different creative approaches.
I'd like to jump in here if I could on this point, actually, which also resonates with Kalena's point, which is, part of it, and the issue of what can we do with an app, the way in which apps seem to be more focused on individuals. How do we change at a higher level? I think one of the factors that we need to look at, and I saw there were some questions along these lines in the Q&A, is what we can call a cultural narrative. Mm-hmm. So if we look at the top 10 countries generally in all of the happiness indices, actually, however they're measured, like by the Diener scale or what have you, you find the Scandinavian countries all of them are there in the top 10. And, one of the reasons for that, of course, is that there's certain access to resources, definitely. There's also a lot of homogeneity historically in those cultures, with actually marginalization of native peoples. So there are issues in that regard. And it's been more challenging recently with an very large influx of immigrants, especially in Sweden. But what we do find is that those cultures, consistently rank in the top 10, all of them. And one of the features that's really interesting is to ask, well, what is different about, let's say, American culture, the culture in the United States, as opposed to Scandinavian culture. And one of them is actually, there are several features that correlate with happiness, but one of them is trust. And that trust goes with a kind of cultural narrative in Scandinavia, which is you trust your neighbor. If you have a problem, you can go to your neighbor. Also, you trust your government. If you have a problem, the government is going to help out because the government is actually just an extension of your neighbor. So there is this attitude in which, you know, we trust each other and we will take care of each other. And that's a very strong aspect, one aspect of Scandinavian culture, which seems to correlate with, you know, this high level of happiness. Another aspect is a de-emphasis on individualism in a much stronger sense that, you know, if it's not about you, it's about us. And if we're going to succeed, we have to succeed together. And there are very strong cultural motifs along those lines. And I think part of what we need to do is not just change, we have to open up the space for individuals to let go of certain kinds of cultural narratives, but we also need to offer some other kind of cultural narrative. And I think that's actually really key. The culture right now, you know, it's really quite devastating. Many of the poor communities in especially rural America, which are often predominantly white, there's a level of desperation, there's a level of mistrust, very high levels of mistrust of the government, of people who live in the cities. And there's also a certain level of incredible desperation, actually,
Yes.
which we find also expressed in
Right.
the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, thank you for pointing to those, John. We have a lot of fabulous questions about the role of awareness in social change. We will look at those before our group panel this afternoon and try to address more of your questions. One of the themes that has emerged is, you know, as Colleen and Richie described, is we have cultural pressure to be wired, to be rewarded by false joy, false positives, consumerism. We have this opportunity, a reset, as we come out of this, to be different. And the social change of smoking was from the heart, and an attitude change, as well as policy change. And this is our opportunity for these 4 pillars, for people to actually become aware that purpose is what is true joy and what is meaningful. And so I just think it's such an exciting time, Richie, with open doors, the walls are down, people have had to look inside for these messages to really permeate and go global, and especially with connectivity. So I'm so excited by the work that all of you are doing, and that, you know, this global community that we're right now who are listening, you are all doing such important work. We're seeing this on the chat feed with these vulnerable communities, as well as with thought leaders. So we have 1 more minute. I'd like to leave it back to Richie for any closing comments.
I just really, I'm sorry we don't have more time, but we'll have time later this afternoon for a group discussion. I want to just thank all of you for your time and consideration, and please be part of this global community of change. May you all be inspired from this work that you've heard to both engage in individual as well as social change in this post-pandemic period, which I really think will be a great opportunity. So thank you.
Richie, thank you. Alyssa, thank you so much, both of you, and also panelists, for your questions and insights. We will take a 15-minute break. I hope you will take your eyes off your computer screen instead of trying to sort out your email, stretch, take a little walk, and then we will begin promptly at 10:45 with a meditation led by our beloved friend, John Dunn. And then John will move into his presentation. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roshi Joan. Thank you, everyone.